Hey everyone, today I'm speaking with Dr. Jennifer Hinton. She's an ecological economist, a systems researcher, and an author of an upcoming book on building a sustainable post-growth economy. Her research into post-growth business uses a systems lens to really connect the dots between that for-profit motive and the crises that we're facing, whether it's inequality or ecological breakdown. Crucially, the framework helps us see what we can do about it at the level of business. So in this conversation today, we're going to cover why that relationship to profit as a legal dimension is the most fundamental layer of all, how big tech exemplifies everything that needs to change, and why even well-meaning people inside for-profit organizations struggle to get traction. We'll be talking about what genuine alternatives look like, from steward ownership to not-for-profit business models, with real case studies, including Patagonia. And we end with a vision of what a post-growth aligned week might actually feel like to live. So whether you work inside a large corporation and want to understand where you do and don't have power, or you're just trying to make sense of why systems feel so stuck, this conversation will give you a clearer lens for all of it. Enjoy. Jen, it's a real pleasure to have you here on the Moral Footprint podcast, in part because it was actually reading your book, How on Earth, way back in 2021. It really gave me like a genuine light bulb moment about the economy as we know it can actually be different and that there are alternatives. But importantly, really understanding how the system that we have bakes in inequality, it bakes in some of these like global crises that we want to change. So I think to kind of get us started, I'd love to hear a bit more about how did your journey start to becoming an ecological economist and researching these sorts of systems?
Yeah, great. Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Jenny. It's really a pleasure to be able to have this discussion with you and share this discussion with others. My journey into thinking about the economic system from an ecological economics perspective basically started when I did my master's. I did my master's in sustainability science and environmental studies because I was really curious about how we can make the world work for everybody without destroying the environment on which we depend. And that was a 2-year master's program in Lund in Sweden. I ended up doing my master's thesis on the circular economy because I kept coming back to, this tension between the environment and the economy. Throughout this 2 years master's, it just kept sort of coming to the surface. Like, we need to protect forests and ecosystems, but, those are also very financially valuable.
Mhm.
So there was always this tension, and I wanted to get into that. When I heard about the circular economy, it seemed like this perfect solution, right? Like, we have this linear economy that is just taking out resources from the environment on one end, turning them into goods and services, and then pumping them out as waste and pollution on the other end.
Mm.
So if we could use the waste of that system as inputs for
Job done.
manufacturing and production, yeah, it's like, okay, great. So the circular economy, at first seemed like, okay, the solution. Then when I was writing my thesis about it, I realized, okay, it's often framed in terms of we need a circular economy for green growth or sustainable growth.
Mhm.
And then I thought, okay, but if the circle, even if we could make it perfectly circular, which we can't because physics don't work that way, we'll always have some waste and need to take some new resources. But even if we can make it as circular as possible, if we're trying to grow the circle, those resources for growth have to come from somewhere. And that's also going to have other impacts in terms of emissions and pollution. This then, it became clearer to me, okay, so yes, it's about the economy, but it's not, what about the economy? This growth part of the economy is something that we
Mm.
need to get to the bottom of. And so I graduated back in 2008. And so that was really early on in these discussions about going beyond economic growth, post-growth, degrowth, these things. But I was able to find a network of people who were also really interested in this question of, okay, how can we go beyond economic growth? What are those kinds of alternative economic systems that are out there? And I realized that there weren't actually very many concrete alternatives. There were sort of like
Mm.
little pieces in terms of, how people can behave differently, different sorts of cultural values that can be the underpinning of that different system. But what in concrete terms does that system look like was still very much an open question. And so that's what I was drawn into, is like, I want to be part of helping to develop these alternatives that can replace and help us transition from this
Hmm.
growth-driven economic system that's trapped us in these crises.
I have to say that's a very useful image that you've put in my mind about this circular economy. Yes, it's a circle, but if you keep trying to make it bigger and bigger and bigger, that's by definition not going to be sustainable on a finite planet. So thank you for that image. That's helped me just better understand where you're coming from. And you talked about how after your masters and especially during your masters, it was still very early on in this kind of connection between business and going beyond economic growth. And so maybe that's a good segue to talking about the framework that you've kind of put together of those 5 post-growth like business dimensions that presumably help us understand what you were saying before. Can we replace business as it is, or can we transition it? So do you mind sharing a bit more about that framework? And I guess specifically, what gap were you trying to fill by creating this sort of systems level understanding of how business works?
Sure. So then, fast forward a few years, and I'm doing a PhD and trying to develop post-growth economic theory and models. And I found while looking through the literature on post-growth and degrowth organizing that there was sort of a gap between, first of all, there wasn't much talk about business at all. And it was often talked about as like business. What might business look like in a post-growth or degrowth economy? And for me, what I had come to realize in my journey up to that point, which involved writing How on Earth, the book that you read, was that business isn't just like some little aspect like, okay, that's often talked about in degrowth as technology and work, and there's these different aspects. No, business is actually the basic building block of our entire economic system. So we can't have a post-growth transition if we don't change business. So that's one key thing that I didn't find anybody else talking about it in that way. Another gap was the connection between the micro and the macro. Part of the reason I think people weren't talking about business is ecological economics and post-growth had sort of inherited this false dichotomy and this false separation between macroeconomics, the functioning of our larger economy and how regulations and markets work, and microeconomics, like looking at individual organizations or businesses and how they use pricing and advertising and these sorts of things. And so these are siloed in conventional economics, and they ended up also being siloed in ecological economics and post-growth approaches. But actually, if business is the basic building block of our entire economic system, which I think it is, and we need to look at it that way, then we have to break past this imaginary barrier between the micro and the macro. And that means that the macro dynamics that we see with environmental destruction, climate change, inequality, all of those things are driven by business structures, which happens at the micro level, right? And at the same time, we have to think about, and here's where systems thinking comes in, always looking for like feedback loops, how those macro dynamics then in turn guide and constrain or enable businesses to behave in different ways. So that's sort of like the thinking I was going into, the basis from which I was thinking about how not only should but must business be for a post-growth economy to meet our needs within ecological limits. And so then thinking about most of the literature at that time, so this was back in 2020, 2019 that I was looking at it, was talking about, post-growth or degrowth business has to be small and local, and there was some talk about ownership, but it was like family owned or worker owned, and those were like the two things. And then the word social enterprise was thrown around because they should be oriented towards social and environmental needs, not making more money. So there was some sort of understanding there, but it was really piecemeal, and different papers were focusing on different parts of this. So I wanted to bring all of it together, also from this more systemic perspective. And that's where I came up with these 5 dimensions, which are like, yes, size and geographical scope, like local or global, that is important, whether it's small or big or global. But that's sort of an effect or result of these other more structural aspects of the business. So then, and another important dimension that was talked about is strategy. We need circular economy strategies in business and stuff. Okay, great. But that again still doesn't get to the structure. There was actually quite a lot of focus on democratic governance of businesses, as it's quite important to get input from workers and from the community about what the business is doing and how. So then governance guides strategy, right? And then strategy will lead businesses to be local, global, small or big. And so I started to see how these things came together and sort of flowed. And also from a more institutional perspective, as you get deeper into the more structural layers, these are the layers. So when we get into like organizational form, how you register your company as a legal entity, that, like you say, bakes in certain things because it's a legal structure. So you sign those papers and that's how the government
It's
sees your company.
essentially the purpose legally embedded, isn't it? That's like what you're supposed to focus on.
The purpose and then, tied to that is the ownership structure, because the purpose, like the conventional business structure that we have in our economy is for profit. And so the purpose is financial gain for investors and owners. And in order to serve that purpose, then it entitles private financial ownership to the investors so that, I invest in your company, I get shares. And then that entitles me to dividends of your profit as a company in perpetuity, as long as I own those shares, right? And as long as the company exists. So that is, like, again, part of this driving dynamic for the more macro dynamics. But we can talk about that in a minute. But just like with those 5 dimensions, which are the relationship to profit as not-for-profit versus for-profit, as a legally binding thing that cements in the purpose and financial ownership of a company. And then on top of that, incorporation structure, which is like the more contextual, like, is it a partnership or is it a shareholder company publicly traded on the stock market, or is it a worker-owned company, or is it a foundation-owned company? And how does the more like specific incorporation models there? And then governance on top of that. How are decisions made? What are the protocols for that? Who gets to be on the board and whatnot? And then strategy. And at the very top, sort of the tip of the iceberg, is size and geographical scope.
And I just want to add to that, because when I saw the pyramid with the relationship to profit being the deeper layer that then ultimately defines what happens across the other layers in a way, made me realize that many aspects of corporate sustainability, and for example, if you're someone trying to do good in a for-profit business, you might be thinking, oh, how can I add this initiative here? How can I do this? But really what your framework makes very clear is everything you do will be constrained by that for-profit logic. And, when I think back to my time working in big tech, the OKRs, the objectives, they're always framed around revenue growth, and that you can almost dial back straight back to shareholder primacy. And that's kind of what's baked in. And it's about the pursuit of financial profit. And I think in the book, How on Earth, I think you use the term I think it's like wealth extraction siphon. Can you talk about why relationship to profit is such a crucial layer, and how that connects to, this macro global crisis that we see?
Sure. So going back a little bit to my journey, like when I looked at the post-growth literature, there is a clear understanding that the extraction and accumulation of wealth is a problem, right? First of all, that's part of what's driving inequality, but also is driving growth, because as handful of people are extracting and accumulating the wealth of the system, think of the Elon Musks and Jeff Bezoses of the world, that means there's less for the rest of us. So that means the economy sort of has to grow to compensate for that extraction. And so that's where I was like, okay, how are we recognizing this problem, but not recognizing that happens through business? The extraction happens through for-profit business structures. And then if you look at the alternative, that there are not-for-profit types of businesses around the world that are either wholly owned by a foundation or are non-profit entities that are doing business, selling goods and services for their revenue. Those prohibit the private distribution of profit, so that they stop that wealth siphon, the wealth accumulation siphon, before it even begins. And as Kate Raworth says in her work, it's distributive by design. You don't have to try to wrestle back that money that's been accumulated and redistribute it. So that's where
you've not had that accumulation in the first place, so it's not a problem to solve.
Exactly. So it actually gets to a root cause in our economy of inequality and growth, and even exploitation of workers. A lot of that is done in order to derive profit for private owners, right? So if we if we preclude that, if we get rid of the ability for business owners to even receive that profit, then it takes away so many things, right? So it's really getting to a root cause and changing that.
Yeah. And so when we talk about this wealth accumulation, I do want to touch on, something that's happened really since your framework was created around this AI race where organizations are investing more and more money in sort of capturing natural resources in order to fuel this sort of perpetual growth of AI and LLM systems and so on. And I want to ask a bit about that because when I think about which companies are least compatible with this idea of like post-growth transformation, for me, it feels like big tech is right up there. It has the for-profit logic, it has that shareholder primacy, but ultimately, because they have, more accumulated wealth, for example, than the GDP of many countries, by design, that's unequal. And so when we look at your framework and we think about that, the need of transformation and how right now big tech, it's accelerating this use of resources and wealth accumulation. How can we take a look at your framework and your thinking, and how does that help us at least diagnose the cause? And then how do we get out of that trap?
Yeah. So I mean, looking at the framework, you want to start with the deepest layers, the structural layers, to understand how those structural layers are then like guiding everything else that happens above, the governance and the strategy. So looking at big tech, the for-profit structure that is like venture capitalists and hedge funds and investors that are really looking for the largest financial return on investment possible, then, drives the way that these companies are structured in their incorporation structures, like that they've chosen to be shareholder owned, or some of them might even be privately owned by just a handful of hedge funds. I wouldn't be surprised by that. And then like the governance, right? But the purpose that happens in that bottom layer of relationship to profit, is profit an end in itself or a means to achieving social and environmental benefit, means that, that flows all the way up through. So when it comes to governance, how are decisions being made? For what? For profit, right? So then how are strategy decisions being made? For what? For profit. Are we going to grow and globalize or stay local? Why? For profit. So that means like we're going to grow, buy up as much as we can and globalize as much as we can, because that's going to give us the most profit. So really that is at the heart of it, of the problems we're seeing. I'm not claiming that if all of these AI companies and these big tech companies were not for profit, they'd be angels and everything would be fine. But, just by making that transition to like, if we could, for instance, tomorrow create legislation that says, no, all big tech is going to be not for profit from now on. And we sort of force them to go into full foundation ownership or change their structures to not nonprofit structures. That means they no longer have private owners and investors who are waiting to receive dividends. That means that if we want it to be post-growth, then they have a social and environmental mission that's coupled together, that they understand.
Yes, it has to be environment with social justice like brought into it. They're not two separate things.
Exactly. So that's what we want for post-growth, is this holistic systemic understanding that people aren't well without nature. And so we need to cover both at the same time. And so then you take that totally different purpose of meeting society's needs and meeting within environmental limits, and you take that up through the pyramid to governance, right? What does governance look like then? Well, then you bring in a lot of other people onto the board and into the decision making. Like, we want to know what local communities think of what we're doing, and we want to hear what their needs are. How are we meeting their needs? What needs are going unmet, or are we maybe even harming them somehow? You have representatives for environmental concerns on your board and impacting decision making, like how balanced with nature are we in our decision making and our strategies. And then of course that goes up through strategy and size and scope, and that will define all of those things, just having a different purpose and not having private owners who are expecting dividends.
There's an example I want to raise, because I was listening to a podcast with Luke Kemp, and he was talking about how he researches societal collapse, and he's talking about the need for democratic group decision making. Like, imagine if we go back to the 1980s when Exxon had done their own climate research, realized the implications. If there had been a citizens' assembly sat on top of Exxon as part of that board, we wouldn't potentially be in this mess now. And so for me, it's very exciting, because having that democratic decision making making sure different people's views are inherent into the company also means that it's less likely to lead to those kind of negative outcomes.
Exactly. And so it's sort of both sides. You're making sure that the company actually is meeting needs,
Yeah.
it's doing something good for society, and you're making sure it's not doing harm, right? It's both. And of course, we need regulations as well to keep
Yeah.
companies in check. But I mean, it's got to be part of the DNA as well. Otherwise, right now we're in a system where most companies are set up for private financial gain. And then we've got some governments and, some policymakers and activists trying to put guardrails on that. Like, yeah, go ahead and pursue private financial gain, but only within these guardrails. But those guardrails actually, if we make them strong enough for real sustainability and for post-growth, then
Yeah.
it means that they're not going to make profit. So we've reached a point where there's a fundamental contradiction between this. And the rules we're trying to put on the game defeat the purpose, the objective of the game. And so the objective is always going to win out because that's the underlying,
Yeah. So you're
guiding
saying
principle.
when you have the for-profit principle, that anything you do is a little bit reformist, but it's not actually going to solve the root cause. It's not going to get to the reason why we're in this situation.
Yeah, because these companies are set up to produce profit. So they're going to find a way to do that,
Yeah.
whether it's through, lobbying for policy loopholes and tax loopholes and that sort of stuff. The stuff we see them doing is very rational behavior given what they're set up to do, to deliver profit to owners.
Yeah.
So we have to get to that root cause if we actually want to change things.
And I think that's helpful because it also shows it's not necessarily bad, evil actors who are like deliberately. I mean, obviously, we can argue about certain types of people who maybe are likely to make those sorts of decisions, but this is almost like a structural feature. They're actually doing what the system's intended to do.
Yeah, exactly. And if we change out those bad actors, if you don't like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, if we put it like really nice people into those positions, they're still stuck in a system and a structure that pushes everybody else to act that way. And if they don't act that way, they will just get bought out or beaten out of the game. They will lose. And they know that. So that's why even good people behave poorly in a bad system.
I've been doing some interviews with corporate insiders who see this gap between where their own employers are going and what they know needs to be done. And almost every single person I've spoken to has said, my director or the team leads privately care about the planet, they care about people, but what their role has been trained for and what they're rewarded for is different. So even the people inside these organizations, it's not like they want this to happen. And, obviously that takes me to the research that we did at LSE, leveraging your framework. And we found, I think it was 86% of these professionals in for-profit organizations, they support post-growth business practices. The problem is only about 53% think that their peers do. And that gets to the issue here that when you're in this system that is set up just for profit, any other perspectives are silenced or not considered because it's not going back to that foundational layer of for-profit.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. I was really happy to see the results of that survey. It's excuse me, something I've experienced in my years and years presenting these ideas is like most people are on board. It's just common sense, right? Of course, we should have businesses and markets set up to benefit society and not just a handful of owners. Like that's just common sense. So most people can get on board with this quite easily. So it's just then about how do we come together to have these discussions. Like you said, most people think they're the crazy one in the room if they agree with it. So I found that just holding the space to have these deeper discussions can be really powerful because people can see, oh, I'm not the only one in the room. We can actually come together and have these discussions and maybe even push for changes at the company level, but also the policy level.
I think especially people who don't come from the business world, they're very quick to say, oh, people in business, they're selfish, they just want money, that's what's happening. And you could argue, yes, especially as you rise up the ranks, you probably are more likely to be like that. But most people just want to do a good job and they don't want to have this legacy of harm like following them. And I wanted to talk to you a bit more about how can we come together. You talked earlier about ownership and work ownership and Socratic governance. There's obviously a lot of enthusiasm for like co-op movement and for employees owning their organization. But can you talk us through why that sometimes isn't enough? Because I know you talked about the difference between financial ownership and control and how we can unpick that.
Yeah, no, and that's a really good point. And I just want to say at the outset, I think the cooperative movement is really valuable. I think they're doing great
Mm,
things for moving us in the right direction away from just focusing on private financial gain. But when it comes to ownership, there's a lot of confusion because the way that we've all sort of been taught to think and talk about ownership brings together two things that I think we should be keeping separate. So, like you just said, there's a financial component to ownership of businesses specifically, and there's like a control or management aspect to when we talk about ownership. And the reason we often talk about them, we bundle them together, is because for-profit forms of business do bundle them together, right? You're a financial owner, and so you get some say on the board or your annual meeting where you get to vote on what the company is going to do. So those two things are usually bundled together in for-profit businesses. But not-for-profit businesses actually separate these in a really important and useful way for sustainability. So, of course, not-for-profit businesses still need to be managed. They still need people making the decisions and deciding what the strategy going forward is going to be. So there's that component, but I put that in the governance dimension. And then when it comes to financial ownership, there are no private financial owners, which again comes back to, why this model is so valuable for stopping that wealth siphon that we talked about earlier. So you can think about it as they have no financial owners, or they own themselves in a sense, but there are no private people who are entitled to receive the profit and assets from the company. And that means that all of the profit and assets and all of the surplus has to be reinvested for social benefit, or, the company's operations, which in the end should be benefiting society as well. That's how I think we need to be thinking about ownership. When it comes to like worker ownership, I think a lot of the impulse behind the worker ownership movement is more about giving workers a say in how the company is run. It's more about that governance component rather than financial ownership. But because we're so used to thinking those two things come together, we often just, like, worker cooperatives are typically for profit. So you get your worker share of financial ownership, and you also get one vote. But it's easy to disentangle those. There are worker directed not-for-profit companies, for instance. And there's a nice episode on the Upstream podcast with Della Duncan, where she interviews some people who have been working with the worker-directed
great.
not-for-profit structure, and just getting their insights about how that actually operates on the ground in day-to-day
Hmm.
decision-making and stuff. But it's nice because they're still able to manage the company they work for, but they're not extracting any financial value themselves, right? They get a salary or a
Hmm.
living wage. And then, after you have a living wage, what more do you need? Isn't it better to reinvest that profit to benefiting the rest of the community, or regenerating ecosystems and the kinds of things that we as a society need?
Yeah, that's such an exciting vision. If you could imagine every company actually taking that mission seriously, I mean, it really lights me up to think that's possible. But I want to pivot back just again using my experience, because I've come from big tech, and that is so, in a way, antithetical to where we're trying to go. And you talked about worker ownership, that of course there are limits, but at least if you have one vote, you get a say. But what's really interesting is some of these very big companies, they are set up so that the founders, I'll give the example of Google, and I didn't know this until I left. The co-founders, they have a majority voting control, so they can veto motions from thousands of shareholders because they have 51% voting ownership. However, they only have an economic stake of they vetoed the addition of this environmental sustainability board committee. And the reason why I'm raising that with you is because I used to be an employee thinking, oh, how do I bring climate action into my work? But really, that's just surface level, when actually, I think if more workers in for-profit organizations understood these structural dynamics from your framework, you could very quickly see, I don't have a say. I might be benefiting economically, but I don't have a say. And also, who else is excluded from decision making? That's like the other lens to this.
Yes, and actually that case is also illustrative of why it's important to keep the governance dimension and the financial ownership separate, because they don't always match up one-to-one, even in for-profit companies. And like you say, those founders obviously have an agenda, and that's why they built the company. And so they want to make sure that their agenda is prioritized above all else, and they lock that in that governance dimensions.
Yeah, and that's obviously undemocratic when you think about so many companies at scale having impacts on citizens, on other people whose voices aren't given a say, just goes at odds with what we're trying to achieve. What I thought would be really interesting to talk about next is how certain people have structural power and certain people don't. But what would you say to people who are perhaps part of these larger companies that are less post-growth aligned? What do you think your framework can help them see as to where their entry points might be to create the change that we need?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I mean, I think one thing, like you said, is just to see with clearer eyes the kind of organization that they're in and how that's structured and who it's set up to benefit and why and how. So just seeing that, and then you can then use the framework to map out how much power you have in your position in the company, right? Maybe you can only influence strategy and maybe only to a small degree, but maybe you're in a position where you can influence strategy and governance protocols and push back. So I think the framework is useful for already identifying where you, as whatever position you have in the company, might have some leverage or not. And then, depending on how much leverage you have, you can push for those discussions about making governance more democratic. Hey, can we get some environmental representatives on our board? Can we get people from the community? Can we have more worker representation on the board? That sort of thing. That might not be available to a lot of people at the companies to be able to push for that. But they can open up other discussions about strategy. And I think one of the more important things that you can't do, even especially if you don't have much leverage in the company that you're working in, is, thinking about what you can do in your private life to help push for these more structural changes. Because for me, it's never going to be enough to change company by company and to allow that to just be a purely voluntary process where we have to inspire the owners of these companies to change their ownership structure like Patagonia did. I don't think that that's ever going to be fast enough or good enough. So we need policy changes that enable and also push companies to make these structural changes or, fall out of the game themselves. And so as private individuals, we can see this and come together and push for those changes with petitions and open letters and just building up more and more political will to make the changes that we need.
I love that. And I think also we're so trained to think about our personal role as a consumer or as a citizen. But what I think isn't seen enough by people like who I was, when I was an employee of a for-profit organization, is that actually collectively you can have political power if you mobilize together. And you're right that it's that starting point of almost understanding what's the system that I'm within. But I wanted to touch on something you were saying about, yes, you can have a nature representative on the board, or you can do things in different ways, like based on your 5 dimensions. What do you say to people who perhaps haven't seen those alternatives? Where can they go to see them in real life? Or perhaps we can talk about some of the case studies that you use in your own research to bring this to life of what an alternative could look like.
Yeah, I mean, so one dream of mine is to one day build like a database and collect the best examples. I haven't, that takes a lot of time and money, and I haven't had the time or money to do that. But I often direct people to websites that are set up for steward ownership that display case studies of companies. And steward ownership is a toolbox that helps businesses make these deeper structural shifts in their ownership and governance dimensions. And it takes them away from pure profit seeking in a more social and environmental direction. It doesn't always lead companies to go fully not-for-profit, like the way it did with Patagonia, actually. They had a not-for-profit foundation take over all of the financial ownership of Patagonia, essentially transitioning it from for-profit to not-for-profit overnight.
Mm-hmm.
The subsidiary of Patagonia is still for-profit, but it's fully owned by a not-for-profit parent organization, which means that, has all of the profit is reinvested for social benefit, and there are no private owners receiving the profit. So it meets the definition of a not-for-profit business. But not all companies make that transition all the way with steward ownership. So some companies prefer to take baby steps by putting caps on the distribution of profit. But those are, again, legally binding caps. They put these in their legal charters, their legal documentation, and adding a social purpose, and again, a legally binding social purpose. So going to websites that are displaying case studies of steward ownership. I think there's one just called stewardownership.gr by the Greek people working on this.
Oh, great.
Has some really nice case studies. Another one is the Donut Economics Action Lab. Their business and enterprise group has been working on the deep design of business, what they call. So they're also looking at the financial ownership and governance dimensions.
Right.
And they also have a nice set of case studies. So they're not all not-for-profit businesses, like perfect
But they're showing a
ideal
little
business.
bit about what's possible because,
Exactly.
again, with the interview and also from my own lived experience, it's like if you don't know the alternatives exist, it's very hard to imagine how you can transform. So having those concrete case studies is super valuable. But if we stick with Patagonia, what other lessons can we learn from Patagonia? Because they launched a report, I think it was earlier this year, and they were, of course, saying we're still trying, we're still doing what we can. It's not where we want to be, but we're committed. And I wanted to hear your thoughts around, like, of course, you have the for-profit as a legal entity or not, which is great that they've changed that at the kind of parent level. But what about when that growth logic of having to perpetually sell more fast fashion, of course, we can argue is not necessarily fast fashion, but that idea of needing to keep growing, how can we use Patagonia as a lens to see this idea of sufficiency and resource caps and things like that?
Yeah, exactly. So, like, great that they transitioned their ownership structure. They no longer have private owners extracting and accumulating the wealth that they create, right? Their governance structure is, I think, then we can also critique there that I think the founding family, the Chouinard family, has maintained some really important voting rights there because, again, it comes back to the founding vision and wanting to maintain the family's agenda. So great that their agenda has moved in a more social and environmental direction, but can we democratize that governance a bit more? Can we, not give the family, I forget what percentage of the voting rights, but they have like
I
this
think it's
one family.
majority. I need to check,
Yeah,
but
I
yeah.
think it might be majority as well. So, and maybe the parent not-for-profit organization has a veto, right? Or something like that. But
Yeah.
again, can we make that more democratic? Can we get worker representatives? Can we get other people on that board that makes it a more holistic decision-making process? And then going up a level into strategy, that's where we come into these conflicts about like sufficiency and
Mhm.
growth. They're also famous for having that "don't buy this jacket" or whatever.
Which I
Again,
believe, I don't know if it's true, but I believe, didn't that actually drive more consumption?
I think it might have like, and
Yeah,
I would imagine that was unintentional, but it became like such a
it's a very clever campaign, if so.
yeah, exactly. I mean, it might have been intentional to make it to make more profit. Who knows? But so like maybe not do it in that way. But that's where also that top dimension of thinking of size and scale can also become important. Like
Mm.
maybe it's not sustainable and useful for society, for Patagonia to be a global giant among giants. Can they relocalize? Can they, scale down? And then that, what kinds of strategies can they use to get them there if they want to relocalize or scale down? Maybe even break up into smaller companies that are then locally owned and managed and rely only on local resources through a circular economy
Yeah.
model. Those kinds of things are some ideas for strategies they could talk about. Yeah.
Yeah, and that touches on a very important point that I've come to see more and more through your work and through other things I've been reading. But this idea of rootedness and relationship to place, if you lose that relationship, it's so much easier for people at the top to offload harm elsewhere because it's out of sight, out of mind, isn't it? And so can you maybe help us think, like, of course, Patagonia is multinational. Yes, it could potentially break up into small organizations, but why do you think that relationship to place is so crucial through that lens of staying true to what's actually happening, like the harms that are being created? Because they're so often just hidden, aren't they, from the executives who are causing them?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so thinking about a fully sustainable post-growth business, we would want a business that is more relocalized, reusing and repairing and refurbishing as
Mm.
many resources as possible to avoid taking out new resources, very much in touch with the needs of the local community that they're set up to serve. So if we talk about governance with Patagonia right now as a globalized company, and I say, okay, can we get the community representatives on the board? Which community, right? It's so
Yeah.
big. Who do you just take somebody from every country that it operates in? Like that doesn't really make much sense. So relocalizing allows us to have, like you said, more democratic governance, and we can have local community members come in we could have town halls, companies should have
Yeah.
open meetings where they get feedback from the community and the consumers that they serve and their beneficiaries, but also the people who might be affected by their operations who
Exactly.
they don't serve.
Because like the employees and the customers is obviously one segment, but what your work draws attention to is other stakeholders. And, I think it was I want to say House of Hackney, who have a seat on the board, a legal representative for nature and future generations. But it's just about opening up the idea of stakeholders. Many companies say on the surface, oh yes, we take on feedback from lots of different stakeholders. But your work also suggests that is good, but ultimately, is there also a legally binding way that those voices are embedded in the governance?
Exactly. Like governance, because when you just get some surveys, it's on that strategy level. But governance refers to the rules, the protocols of decision making. So it's a much more structural thing. Like, how are we going to make decisions going forward? Like, have meetings twice a year with these different groups of people. Like, so it's really about building those protocols and rules in a way that is inclusive. And like you say, bringing in voices that aren't necessarily directly benefiting from the company, but might be affected by the company. So
Yeah.
we always have to come back to that systemic level, because then you think about supply chains, right? So it has to be about locally sourcing inputs and supplies as much as possible. And if not, if you do need to get something from further away, making sure that that's a really transparent and also sustainable supply chain.
I love that. And, you just touched on going back to that system level. And, in our interactions, when I've been talking to you about, oh, here's how I'm thinking of using your own framework to create certain case studies, you made a very clear point at the end that one company changing or firm level transformation is great, but it's not going to be enough for what we need. And so for you, what does genuine systems level change require? Of course, regulation, but given our entire economic paradigm is that root causing so many of these systemic crises, I mean, this is a big question, Jen, but how do we get out of it?
I have the plan. No, I have some thoughts that we should democratically deliberate. I mean, there are policy changes that we need, like I said before, that can sort of unlock businesses and enable them to make this transition along all of the dimensions that we need them to make. So like policies that start to favor not-for-profit businesses and startups, with seed funding and grants and incubators and subsidies and public procurement, all of those nice policy levers that are currently favoring large for-profit incumbents. We can just transition those to favor not-for-profit companies, and that will encourage companies to make this transition. Bold government could even say, look, we are in a time of polycrisis. This is getting too dangerous, and so our overarching policy aim is to have every company in the country or in the region not-for-profit within the next 5 years. And here's how we're going to help you do that. Here's how we're going to enable that. So that's one thing, just in terms of changing business. Then in terms of the larger policies, like you mentioned resource caps before, yeah, we need resource caps. We need hard lines around, to protect our ecosystems that are perishing under the status quo. So building up all of those infrastructures, and there's a lot of post-growth experts in those larger policies about resource caps and stuff who know much more than me, but I think that's part of it. Another really important part of it is redistributing the wealth that has accumulated so that we can take off that growth imperative. All of that accumulation, I mean, we're talking about like trillions of dollars of wealth that have been accumulated by billionaires.
And continue to be accumulated.
Yes, and they
Yeah.
can and should be used to help us resolve our crises as societies. And that's got to be coupled with reparations, I think, for historically exploited communities to benefit more from that than. So there's got to be a lot of deep discussions about why we're doing this, and that guides how we're doing it. But yeah, big changes. But we're also in a time of big changes, right?
Yeah.
So what used to seem impossible is already possible today. And a lot of that is bad, right? We see what Trump's doing. We see new wars breaking out. Things that I thought just 10 years ago are impossible. They're not impossible. They're happening right now.
I
So maybe
agree.
that also opens the window for us to talk about positive changes.
I think so too. And even just assuming, oh, everything's fixed, business is always going to be like this, that in itself is defeatist, because it's that way of thinking is preventing you from seeing all the alternatives that are possible. So if we come back to big tech, I recently read Digital Degrowth by Michael Kwet, and his deeper argument is that big tech companies, because they're essentially colonial landlords, they now own the infrastructure of communications. They have monopolies on commerce and now, of course, AI as well. How do we then think about this need for a post-growth movement when the broader systems are almost being like colonized by big tech? What's your take on, can this ever be reformed, or do we almost have to see them collapse? What's your take on how we'll move on from there?
No, it's a good question. And in some ways, it's easier for me to imagine the ideal of what we want to have in the future and then backcast to see how we
Yeah,
get.
to
So
see the gap.
yeah, and start to see how we get from here to there without having a concrete vision of where we want to go. It can be hard to strategize, right? So for
Mm,
me, and it would be really interesting to hear what you think about, because you're an expert in the and big tech area, and I'm not necessarily, although I do find it super interesting and important. I would say, like, a sustainable post-growth future, what does this look like? What does AI and tech look like? And I would say,
mm,
a lot of it actually should be treated, and this is not my own personal insight, but I've read this by others and I agree, is that it should be treated as like a public resource, right? Sort of like public transport. And so that can happen either through nationalizing these huge
mm.
companies that own so much of our infrastructure, because it's basically like public infrastructure at this point, except for it's privatized. So
Yeah.
we could nationalize it, make it public infrastructure. A lot of it, I think, should be done that way. A lot of it could also be it's smaller, more local foundations, but the things that connect us internationally maybe need to be more public. And then the question about the resource intensity, I was at the Degrowth conference in Oslo this last summer. And I went to one of these sessions. There were quite a few sessions about AI, actually, which is really good. And it was like, okay, what does AI look like? What would it serve in a degrowth future? Different tables or groups of people came up with different
Mm.
answers. But our table was, okay, given the fact that we're already exceeding planetary boundaries by so much, and there's like these technologies are so resource intensive with water and energy and land and everything else, like maybe degrowth doesn't need AI, or maybe it like serves a very small sort of
Yeah, in
peripheral
almost
role.
like it can work for a clear societal purpose, but also so much of what it is being used for right now is not really tied to core needs. And this idea of it should be maybe as a commons, because it is something that we all are using and it's how we're communicating right now, using the internet. I had actually come across an article just today in the New York Times about how Meta, because the national grid in the US is not going to give them enough electricity to fuel their acceleration of AI, they're now privatizing their own creation of electricity using like mini turbines. And, when I was thinking about this, it's the same issue where they can still draw off the national grid when they need to, but they're privatizing and taking these sort of finite resources. What you were saying just now really resonated, because if you start with planetary boundaries as that outer circle, is what you're doing expanding and breaching those boundaries, or is it reducing? And I think fundamentally, if you look at most companies, they are going the wrong direction. It's about how do you keep that as the constraint, and that has to be a real constraint, not something you can try and engineer your way out of, which is what so many of these huge companies are trying to do.
Yeah, sort of the decoupling. No, but we're using
Yeah,
wind farms or whatever. It's like, yeah, but where do all the resources come from to build those wind turbines? I mean, it's
exactly.
not like they just come from nowhere. So all of this is material and energy use, and that's pushing us beyond the planet. And then just like you said, we always have to tie it back to what needs is it actually
Mm,
meeting? And, so you see the massive amount of AI sort of slop videos that are out there, and people like on LinkedIn making AI pictures. The amount of resources used for these different things nobody needs these things. I mean, you can't argue that these are fulfilling real needs. And then if you go to the other side of it, the surveillance and the
mm,
military uses of these are actually doing
I know.
harm rather than meeting needs. So there are big discussions to be had there. And then when we talk about, okay, what could post-growth AI look like, then I think we start by cutting out all of the low-hanging fruit, the stuff that we
Mm,
absolutely can agree is not needed, and then have discussions about what is doing harm and how can we maybe change that. Okay, maybe we do need AI for some security purposes, but that should be
yeah.
a publicly owned thing, right?
And just on the topic of surveillance, and of course, my former employer with Project Nimbus, that more than $1 billion joint contract with Amazon, which then obviously was used to target people in airstrikes in Gaza. But again, if we look at your framework, what's really clear to me, and I wouldn't have realized this before, but if it's starting from that logic of profit, how can we make money? And of course, if they're looking for new pockets to accumulate wealth, siding with like the US military and those sorts of contracts, that is helping their short-term financial gain. That's why I think your work is very clear in that the underlying purpose driving so many of these. I wouldn't even call it an externality because it's almost like by design.
Yeah, it is. It's by design, and I don't know how consciously the creators of this design chose it or understood the
Yeah.
dynamics that would come from it. Who knows? That's a bigger discussion, but it's definitely like part of the system design.
Yeah. Let's pretend that we've moved into this post-growth society and people's needs are put first. We all have this relationship to place. Everything's great, Jen. And we're, centered on sufficiency and care. What might an ordinary week look like for us?
This becomes very contextual, right? I am a white American woman living in Northern Europe, so this would change from place to place drastically, I think. But for me, compared to what we have now in Scandinavia, like working week would be a lot shorter, right? Because things are being produced in a very circular way. Everything lasts a lot longer. Things are built to last, built to be repaired easily. Like, I don't need to buy much stuff very often. I've got a nice vegetable patch. I can grow a lot of my own food with my
And you have time to do your vegetable
neighbors.
patch?
I have time to do it. And that's this virtuous circle because I don't need much money, because I don't need to buy much stuff. I don't need to work much. The larger economy doesn't need to produce much. So the larger economy doesn't need us to work much. So it all is about like this downscaling. It creates this really nice virtuous circle where we can all have enough. We can have better levels of equality because everything is getting cycled back through, guided by who needs what, and more time to just connect with ourselves, connect with our loved ones, connect with nature. I love going for long walks in the forest. I'll have more time to do that. I've always wanted to learn how to play the piano. I would maybe have time to do that. And the community can rebuild those ties that have been ripped apart in so much of the world due to having to work and being part of the rat race and, working 40, 50, 60 hours a week. You don't have time to connect with your neighbors much. I mean, barely have time to connect with your family. So
yeah, I love that. And also all of this accumulation of wealth, it's only been enabled due to extraction and, offloading costs to others and to the planet itself. It's not actually making people happy anyway. So what we're saying here is that this post-growth movement is about sufficiency, but it's also about well-being. And to wrap up the conversation, you mentioned you have a book coming out in June. Can you share a bit more about the book and how people can find you?
Yeah, sure. So the book puts forward a vision and a model of a sustainable post-growth not-for-profit economy based on the existing types of not-for-profit businesses we already can see around the world in lots of different contexts and lots of different sectors. So just imagining what would it look like if the entire economy was not-for-profit, if we had need-based markets made of not-for-profit businesses instead of profit-driven markets made up of for-profit businesses. And so putting out that model and that vision and explaining how it could work and how it would lead to these better dynamics of better equality, more ecological stewardship, higher levels of well-being, and then offering an explanation, because before you put out that kind of a vision, you have to also diagnose the problems. The first part of the book really goes into what is the structure of our for-profit economy? Why is it problematic that for-profit business is the building block of our global economy? And how does it drive the dynamics of inequality, overconsumption, environmental degradation we're seeing? Part 2 is the not-for-profit economy we could have. And then part 3 gives some ideas about how all of us can help transition from this wildly unsustainable for-profit economy we have now.
Great. And I know so many people who are hungry for this book. I just want to say thank you so much, Jen. It's been incredible to learn about your work and for it to influence my own thinking about business. And importantly, that business can change and that there is an alternative. That's for me the most important thing.
Well, yeah, thank you, Jeni. I'm just so happy that you found my work useful, and thanks for having me on today.
Thank you.